Well, now let's discuss this further. We're now joined via Zoom by Mervyn Abrahams Programme Coordinator for the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, sir. Now, of course, South Africans are stretched at the moment. I mean, you've just heard that previous clip in terms of just how much, they have to pay in terms of, getting, school books and getting their children ready for the new term and for the new year. But as we've heard, back to school is not cheap. So you are calling basically for a special back to school grant to be given to those families that are battling. So speak to us a little bit about how that will play out. How do you see that working, particularly if there are already calls for the basic income grant?
Yes, so good afternoon, and good afternoon to all your viewers. Yes, we are calling not so much for a special grant as for a top-up on the child support grant at the beginning of each year. We know that close to almost 13 million South African children are receiving the child support grant. However, that grant is set at 480 Rand, which is way below the food poverty line. And so really what we're asking is that at the beginning of each year, that grant be, in our view, doubled actually, to help with going back to school. The reason for it is as follows. If parents or caregivers do not get any extra support in January, they will have to take from the child support grant, which already is not sufficient to provide children with sufficient and nutritious food. And in fact, ensuring that children go to school in a good environment is in fact an investment in the future economic growth of South Africa. It is not charity. It is not giving extra money to somebody undeserving. It is in fact a means through which we can invest in children so that our education outcomes are in fact better. And if our education outcomes are better, of course, there's every chance that our economic growth in 10 or 15 years from now will be much better. And that's the reasons why we are calling for a top-up in January on the child support grant to allow parents to negotiate this very difficult financial times.
I can tell you, Mr. Abrahams, just because of the interviews that we have been having with parents, with even educators, that the prices are so high that what you are proposing will probably be met with some positivity. But the reality, though, if you look at the country, if you look at the economic situation, and also just calls of having, the basic income grant still being debated, it makes it seem impossible almost, for government to be able to meet parents halfway. How do you propose then, they do this, as it relates to the top up of the child support, given, just how we are faring as a country?
So essentially, I mean, what we are seeing at the moment, and all this talk about we do not have sufficient income in the treasury, our revenue is low, there's very low tax payers, etc. Of course, all of those are based on realities. But in fact, it is the chickens coming home to roost out of bad economic policies made 10, 15, 20 years ago. So, in fact, what we need to decide now is, can we afford not to secure a proper, good, educated workforce 15 years from now? Or are we going to continue this trajectory by saying there is no funds in Treasury, therefore it cannot be given? Because the implication is that we will then continue to in fact contract our economy going down the line. That's really the choices we make. And one of the important reasons is that already we have about 25% of our boy children under the age of 5 are stunted. So their brain is affected by malnutrition. So to take any more of the child support grant and spending it on uniforms rather than on food only makes a problem much worse for South Africa in the future. So we would argue that we cannot afford not to do it. And so now let us, on that basis, begin to say, how do we restructure the budget? Where do we cut back? Do we need as many security to protect politicians? Do we need as many politicians as we have and traditional leadership? Can we cut back on that? Where in the current budget can we cut back in order to ensure that we invest in our children, which then is an investment in South Africa's future 10, 15 years from now?
And to your point, Mr. Abrahams, I mean, your organization spends a lot of time looking at household affordability data year in and year out. Now, I mean, I'm just looking at some of these numbers. To have to ask parents to choose between buying food and buying uniform. In our previous clip, one parent said 1,400 rands he spent on just 4 items of clothing for one child. But when you look at some of your statistics, you know, dating between December 2021 and December 2022, it's quite staggering that a family of 4, just on the basic food, price list, they spend just close to 3,000 rand just on the basic food items. I mean, I'm not even going into the nice to haves. And then that excludes, of course, the household, domestic and the personal hygiene products, which cost another 1,000 rand. And if you look at the unemployment, rate and the stats currently in the country, it's almost impossible a task that we are asking South Africans at the moment, particularly those that are struggling.
Exactly. And this is a problem which has been coming on to us since the post-apartheid period, when we haven't really transformed our economy in order of looking towards ordinary households. So now we find ourselves in a very deep household affordability crisis. Correctly, as you've said, our basket of 44 foods have increased over the last year by a whopping 577 rand. It's more expensive now than it was a year ago. When we look at a national minimum wage, which is about 3,500, then just the cost of transport and electricity takes almost 60% of that wage, leaving something like 1,400 left over from that wage for food, for uniforms, for all other things. So we are in the depth of a crisis, and we have to now take really deep decisions to ask, how can we get out of this crisis in 10 or 15 or 20 years from now? Because we currently, on our wages, we just cannot afford it.
Absolutely. Mr. Abrahams, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Mervyn Abrahams, and he's a program coordinator for the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. They're asking, of course, for government to give parents who are struggling a top-up of the child support grant ahead of the opening of schools every year.